Today, we're going to talk about the Pacific Coast Highway, which, granted, is an odd way to start a watch review, but we're actually talking about the watch, not the road. So this is the Monterey Bay version of the Pacific Coast Highway, or PCH, from the new brand Loci Watches. Or maybe it's pronounced Lōcī. I'm not sure. It's supposed to be Latin for location. And I think a lot of people, when they see this, are just going to mispronounce it as Lōcī. Either way, it's a cool watch, and I really love the concept of it. And the brand as a whole, which is the main reason I agreed to do this review. And for the sake of transparency, the promotional tag is up because they did provide this watch and I don't have to send it back. I know some of you don't care, but others do, and I always like to be upfront about this. Now, Lōcī is a Los Angeles-based micro brand, kind of along the same lines as Notice and Vaer. And just like them, they are focusing on US assembled watches. But where Lōcī is doing things different is that they're focusing their designs so that their watches have a connection or inspiration from a specific location. This idea of a spirit of a place being captured in the design, hence the name Lōcī, or location. And the first watch they're doing this with is the PCH, which if you're not from the West Coast, you may not be familiar with Pacific Coast Highway, but it's one of the most beautiful stretches of road in the entire world, as it stretches practically the entire western coastline of the United States, from the top of Washington all the way down to San Diego. And what I think is cool here is that it's not just the model that's representing the PCH as a whole, but that every colorway is unique to a specific location along it, which is a concept I love, as I firmly believe the watches you love the most and the ones you keep the longest are the ones you have connections to. Otherwise, why are you buying and keeping them? There's got to be some reason. And my Monster is a great example of this. At this point, I have far better divers, but I love this one because of the penguin feet on the dial. It reminds me of going to SeaWorld all the time as a little kid. It takes me back. And I should point out that I'm talking about SeaWorld in San Diego. While I've spent the last couple of decades here in Texas, I was born and raised in San Diego, which is another reason I love this concept. I'm actually familiar with some of these iconic locations. Now, unfortunately, right now there are just 3 versions of the PCH. And maybe there will be some more in the future, maybe some specific to San Diego. But as it is, I actually really love how on the website there are notes for each version, just talking about how each design was inspired. So like with this one, the Big Sur, which is perhaps the most PCH version of it, here it does mention a specific photo at a specific location along the highway. Then there's also the sandy-inspired Surfrider Beach, which came again from another photo right where the waves hit the sand. And another thing I should point out, and this is going to be important when we start talking about price, is that 10% of the sales go to the Surfrider Foundation, which is another California-based organization that's dedicated to keeping the beaches and the oceans clean. So there is a good cause associated with this too. And then there's this specific version, the Monterey Bay. Obviously a more ocean-themed version, as Monterey Bay is home to the National Marine Sanctuary, the very famous aquarium, and some very deep underwater canyons. So for this version, there's obviously the waves, but there's also an upper and lower level, with the lower level having a darker blue representing the deeper waters. And there are a few things I really like with this design, like the bar-applied indices. They just seem to hover over that trench, kind of like a boat would on the surface. They're brushed on top, which matches the matte design of the dial, while the polished internal edge catches the light subtly as it moves around. In fact, the whole watch here seems to come more alive in real sunlight than indoors, including this wavy pattern, which really is the key feature with this design. It's eye-catching while still being somewhat subtle. And it's not just painted on, it's actually a physical texture. And I was really impressed with how the pattern continues across the upper and lower levels, bringing an entire level of cohesion into the design. Then there's the chaptering at the outer edge, which at first I thought was just painted on. Yet looking closer, you can see that there are raised notches molded into the outer ring. And I think when you take that, the indices, the trench, the texture, and all this adds up to a lot of interesting depth on a watch that's still relatively thin at 11 millimeters. Now, as unique as this dial is, I think the case here comes across as equally as interesting, which isn't something that happens all that often. as it's not overly complex. It's actually somewhat of a simple design. Yet there's something about it that's really cool, really engaging. It's kind of this squat cushiony case, yet at the same time seems oddly streamlined, which makes no sense whatsoever. It's a very rounded, curvy case, yet also one that's defined by some sharp, rigid angles, as well as this very tall protruding bezel. And for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why, it actually reminds me of a Frederic Constant High Life, like a non-integrated bracelet version. Now, since this is a sports watch, it is mostly brushed, the top and the sides, so it's appropriate and, more importantly, what I prefer. And then, as most watches have, there is a polished chamfer. But here it's wider at the ends and then sort of thins out as it gets to the middle, as well as it then transitions into the entire outer edge of what is essentially the lugs. And all of this seems to create this interesting optical effect, causing your eyes to just go up and down the entire thing, which is further encouraged by the linear brushing on the top and these really thin etched lines that lead right to the edges of the strap, causing it to seem maybe taller, even though it's fairly squat. Like I said, it's interesting, and I'm hoping that really comes across in these images, and you don't think I'm a total crackpot. And even though it does come with these great fitted rubber straps, which adds cohesion to the whole thing, thanks to that cushiony case, you don't really lose much by swapping straps to something different. And in particular, I think this thing looks cool with the blue dial and a tan leather. As well as, notice this on the side, drilled lugs. That rubber strap is actually quick release, but it's really nice to see that they added drilled lugs in addition. A lot of times it's one or the other, or none. Now, over at the right, there is a pretty oversized crown. Basically, it's big. But it does have some aggressive knurling, and the flip side to all of this is that it's pretty easy to get a hold of. And then flipping it over to the rear, and you have one of the coolest casebacks I've seen. It is secured with small screws, so if you ever wind up taking this thing off, be careful not to lose them. But it has this really interesting two-tone design, which at first glance may just seem like an odd shape, but when you take a closer look at it, you actually realize that it's part of the coastline of California, right off the coast of Los Angeles, with the Channel Islands down there near the bottom, and San Diego's probably right about where that last screw is. Or maybe that's Oceanside, which seems oddly appropriate. Either way, really cool design, and I love the idea of this. But there is one issue with it. But when picking it up, the left side here feels really sharp. Right where the coastline starts and right where there's this circle with all the pertinent information. Really rough to run your fingers along it. So that is one disappointing thing, but it's overall really cool when you consider the whole concept of the brand. And as for Lume, Lume is good. Nice, bright, and easily able to keep up with the Seiko diver. So no complaints. Although at one point I was thinking that I would like it if it was more white colored Lume on the dial than this off yellow. But in retrospect, I think they made the right decision here, as there's already some white highlights on the dial, and this adds more contrast. Overall, it's a really cool, interesting, and original design. Something that is becoming more of a rarity these days, as well as one that maintains a lot of functionality. But before we move on, there are a couple of things I didn't like that I still want to point out. Like the hour hand. The hour hand is way too short. The other hands, I think they're fine, but the blue one may not have the ideal amount of contrast with the blue dial. And then there is something a little bit off about the date window. Now, let me be clear, I'm not advocating for a dateless design. I think on an everyday sports watch, having a date is a good thing. But here, it's kind of in this awkward position that's just maybe a little bit too high on the dial. Although considering the trench is right below that, I guess maybe it was understandable to place it here. And I hate to say this because I really do like the overall design, but zooming in on the macro level, and the dial really doesn't look like a dial I'd expect at this price. I mean, the indices are pretty good, and the hands, even though they're kind of hard to see in these shots, do have some nice definition. But the textured dial itself, it looks a little rough in certain places, especially on the cutout and as you see the outer edge of the beyond the trench. Now, generally, I'm always cautious on how far to push judgment on macro level shots, But once you get above a certain price tag, it's open season. And along the same lines, another big criticism for this price is no bracelet. I mean, the fitted strap here is great, but at this price, not having a bracelet does hold this one back. Which reminds me, price is something we should talk about as well as the rest of the specs. So if you didn't catch it earlier, width here is 39 millimeters with a 48 millimeter lug to lug. Although it is worth pointing out that thanks to these fitted curved rubber straps, it does wind up having a slightly longer effective lug to lug. They stick out a bit, making this one wear just a little bit larger, and I'd say it's closer to a good comfortable 40. Total thickness is a nice thin 11 millimeters. That does include the case back as well as the sapphire crystal. It also has a solid but decent weight of 96 grams on that rubber strap, which overall winds up a good fit on my 7¼ inch wrist. I've actually worn this on multiple days and it's always been comfortable. Never top heavy, easy to read, and I think looks brilliant in the sunlight. Which is good, as this is a true sports watch with 100 meters of water resistance, so you want to be able to go outside with it. And I should mention that does include a signed screw-down crown. And along the same lines, one of the interesting things here is that it's not only listed as being assembled in the US, but it says that every watch is individually pressure tested. So while this may not be an ISO rated diver, if water resistance is important, it's nice to see here. Now, as for the movement, it is powered by a Swiss Sellita SW200, which in some ways is a nice change of pace. I have nothing against Miyota 9000s, in fact I really like them, but that seems to be what I've mostly seen over this last year. I was starting to think microbrands had given up on Sellitas. And last, but certainly not least, we gotta talk price. And the Pacific Coast Highway is listed at $1,050 US. And that is for this automatic version. There's also a course option for $675. But before you say anything, just remember that this is California real estate we're talking about, so that's like nothing to them. I mean, that's like a gallon of gas and a Big Mac these days. Well, maybe not. I still got friends back home, so I had to say that for them. But seriously, like I was saying before, at this price, not having a bracelet is a problem. And in some ways, this is also a much bigger discussion, as originally this whole age of microbrands really came about from a value proposition, that they were kind of coming in and undercutting Seiko, giving you more for less, so to speak. But that's not always the case these days, as a lot of microbrands are sort of abandoning value and trying to focus on more and interesting, unique concepts. And as such, they seem to be hitting this $1,000 price point more and more. Now, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's debatable, and it depends on why you're buying the watches. Like for some people, it's all about uniqueness, while for other people, they're not going to buy it unless they're really getting value out of it. Now here, with the US assembly, the uniqueness of the design, the fact that 10% is going off to Surfrider, it's high, but I think it is justifiable. But the bottom line, if this wasn't obvious already, is that this isn't going to be one for the value hunters out there. In fact, you guys have probably already moved on to something else. But this is one of the reasons I spent so much time talking earlier about the brand and what they're trying to do, the entire concept here, as I think that's partly what you're buying into with this one. You really have to love this whole idea about a spirit of a place. And if you do, and if there's a specific location here that's calling out to you, well, it's a really well-made watch, and one that'll probably wind up being a keeper for you. But again, that's only if you have that personal connection. And personally, I do hope they succeed with this, and that they move on to more versions of the PCH, as well as maybe some new models. Perhaps ones with more of a global inspiration. Because I think this is a great concept, and I really love how each colorway is different. It's a big, beautiful world that offers a lot of inspiration, and can bring a lot of really cool, unique designs into this hobby of ours. And variety is always good. Now, as usual, let me know your thoughts on this one, and if you really like this idea, or if it's just a no-go for you, that it's not worth your time. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe down below. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.